The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 8. Good morning, Michael. Wake up, sleepyhead. Irene Rose walked over and drew the heavy velvet curtain. The early morning sunshine flooded into the bedroom. Michael turned over, wiping his eyes, attempting to protect them from the light. There's a cup of tea for you there, my love. Porridge for breakfast, as soon as you're ready. Her husband struggled upright. I'm still feeling groggy. It was late when we finally finished last night. Father's some good news for you. In fact, I think he might have at least 2 pieces of good news for you. What is it, Rose? That's for me to know and you to find out, Michael O'Donnell. The sooner you come down to breakfast, the sooner you find out. She walked over and kissed him on his up-tilted nose. Don't be too long, love. Father's bursting to tell you. Irene Rose left Michael to organise himself, crossed the landing, and quietly opened the door to the room in which young Daniel had spent the night. The lad lay on his side, his thick dark hair spread out over his pillow. She walked across the room, careful not to wake him, and quietly drew the curtains. That done, she walked back and gently sat down on the side of the bed. Wakey, wakey, Daniel, it's morning. She stroked the lad's hair and smiled as he opened his dark brown eyes, blinking in the sunlight. Did you have a good night's sleep, my love? Yes, thank you. Irene Rose gained the impression his words did not quite ring true. Something was troubling the lad. He pushed himself upright, gazed into her eyes for a moment, and then buried his face against her bosom, putting his arms around her. Irene Rose frowned. Is something wrong, Daniel, darling? What does murder mean, Auntie Rose? Good morning, Matthew. You have a big day before you, the mill owner responded. I guess so, the trade union organiser replied. He walked over to the sideboard where a pan of porridge stood on the small spirit burner, keeping it warm. He helped himself and returned to the table. What are your plans? I'm going to the mill and inviting the operatives to a meeting at Mary's kitchen. Michael's spoonful of porridge came to a halt. A meeting? Yes, I've some proposals for them to discuss. Irene Rose has agreed to accompany me. Knowing my daughter, she'll no doubt have proposals of her own. Do you realise what's happening today? Yes, I might even be better informed than you. Try me, the Irishman responded, finally placing the spoon in his mouth. Whilst you and your comrades have been plotting and planning, the manufacturers and their political allies haven't been idle. They're well aware of the workers' march on Manchester today. That doesn't surprise me. It's not exactly a secret, is it? He said with a smile. We're expecting trouble, but we're marshalling the demonstration. If there's violence, the cause won't be resting on our shoulders. I think you'll find that once the leaders have received a lecture from one of the town's leading justices of the peace, they'll be allowed to proceed into the town unmolested. That's good news, but how can you be sure? Councillor Davitt provided the information. The corporation discussed the matter, the Liberals to a man and supporters of the Anti-Corn Law League. You shouldn't be surprised. Their purpose, after all, is for their mills to be idle. They've even discussed organising lockouts, but decided wisely, in my opinion, that would be self-defeating. They're determined to present the whole affair as an insurrection. They have to, if they're to persuade Peel's government to repeal the Corn Laws. From their point of view, that's the whole purpose of the exercise. Michael laughed. As you've consistently argued, Matthew, I must admit when you first put the thesis forward, I tended not to take it too seriously. But once I became convinced, I've used every opportunity to put your arguments to my colleagues. The question is, have you convinced them, Michael? Yes, I think I have. I also think the manufacturers of this town are in for a surprise. This strike is one they'll regret provoking for years to come. It'll have repercussions they can't possibly envisage. It's spreading and spreading fast. The workers determined and confident, and structures are in place to ensure they don't starve. The strike for once wasn't the dominant issue in Irene Rose's mind. No sooner had young Daniel asked what the word murder meant, he'd broken down and sobbed his little heart out. He'd been aware his mother had been killed and her horse had been involved, but understood it was the result of a tragic accident. The question of her death being caused deliberately had never been mentioned. Irene Rose's discussion with her father the previous evening had been a shocking revelation to the youngster. Irene Rose decided she had no alternative but to explain the circumstances of Bessie's death as sensitively as she could, trying to use examples he could readily understand. A few weeks before, she called in to see the youngsters at Mary's kitchen. Evidently the twin girls, Rachel and Rebecca, had been poking fun at Daniel's friend Emma, and he'd defended her and told them off. She reminded him of this incident and asked him why he stood up to the older girls, who were being supported by Emma's brother Jonathan. He simply replied that Emma was his friend. Irene Rose responded by pointing out the other 3 children were his friends as well, to which he replied they were being unfair to Emma, and that was wrong. Irene Rose went on to explain that Bess would have done exactly the same, how she dedicated her life to supporting and fighting for her friends and fellow mill workers. From that point she was able to explain the nature of the forces Bess and her fellows were up against, how the Nelson Mill operative turned out to prevent more workers being caught by drive belts, and how in the end his mother had so tragically died. She'd explained that Bessie's life hadn't been wasted, how she'd inspired others, including herself, and how her friends felt the need to carry on her work. Much to Irene Rose's relief, Daniel seemed to digest this information in a positive way. He'd soon stopped crying and listened intently to the points she made. However, towards the end he'd become agitated again and eventually angry. At the point where she'd confirmed how Bess had died, he'd bunched his little hands into tight fists and said, "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill the person who killed my mummy." He'd done so in such a serious and determined way, he'd both startled and frightened Irene Rose. "You mustn't think that, Daniel," she'd replied. "Bess won't like that. She wants a good life for you. We must concentrate on Bessie's wishes." "My mummy should be here with me. I miss her. I've always missed her," he responded vehemently. "I need her help as well. I'm going to kill him." Try as she might, she couldn't convince the youngster he was wrong. In the end she simply gave up and changed the subject. The last thing she wanted was to erect any false barriers between them. Daniel was young and vulnerable. She hoped time would resolve the problem. Michael, James Leach and Daniel Donovan had jumped aboard an omnibus and alighted by the railway viaduct outside the railway tavern, ready to make contact with and welcome the marchers proceeding from Hyde. The viaduct roughly marked the border of Hardwick and West Gorton, and thus the boundary of Manchester Borough. They hadn't been there long when the jingle of horses' harnesses, the ring of iron-shod hoofs, and the heavy tread of marching boots attracted their attention. In the distance, proceeding from whence they came, they could make out a detachment of cavalry, a unit of riflemen, and hundreds of bluebottles. Daniel Maud, Esquire, Justice of the Peace, servant of the Manchester Borough Corporation and of the Peel Government, depending on which hat he chose to wear at any given time, obviously didn't mean to be late for his appointment with history, any more than Michael and his friends did. Matthew and Irene Rose, together with young Daniel, walked to Mary's kitchen, and, having left the youngster in Mary's safe hands, father and daughter walked to Gibraltar Mill together. Irene Rose related her earlier conversation with Daniel to her father. He reassured her, remarking that the lad's reaction was understandable if mistaken. He informed her he thought it was something the youngster would come to terms with, and, in the longer term, it wouldn't affect his personal development. Irene Rose hoped her father was right, but had her doubts. They entered the mill, and Irene Rose halted to look at the framed tribute commemorating the woman who played such an important part in her own development and who she was proud to call a friend. She always contemplated the memorial when visiting the premises, but this time it seemed to hold more significance than in the past. To one side of the tribute hung the framed notice detailing the working hours of the operatives. Thanks largely to Bess Ackroyd, Gibraltar Mill had introduced the 10-hour day and reduced hours for employees under 15 to 6, almost 3 years previously, a significant advance on the 10-hour bill still being fought for by the unions. On the other side of this tribute hung a framed portrait in watercolour, painted from memory by young Esther Radcliffe. Irene Rose smiled. Esther had somehow captured Bessie's delicate features perfectly, incorporating the inquisitive, caring, and defiant aspects of her personality in a portrait from which her smiling, good-natured face beamed. She made her mind up to show Daniel the painting. He had no real recollection of his mother. She hurried into the mill to contact the trade union delegates. She had arranged that her father should go straight to the mill superintendent's office to inform James Barcliffe of his intentions, while she gathered the delegates together to escort them to the office for a preliminary meeting. Michael, James Leach and Daniel Donovan stood by the side of the road, staring in disbelief. Although they didn't realise it at the time, the vast promenade of workers approaching them comprised a good 10,000 operatives. The men and women were led by Richard Pilling, a weaver from Ashton, well known as a trade union leader and Chartist speaker. As soon as the head of the approaching march came close, the 3 Manchester trade unionists went to meet them. William Stevenson, Thomas Storer and John Leach, all known to Michael, James and Daniel, accompanied Richard Pilling. They shook hands warmly and warned them the Manchester magistrate awaited. Pilling, Stevenson, Patrick Murphy Brophy, a Chartist lecturer, and William Aitken, a schoolmaster from Ashton, and the 3 Manchester men went to meet Daniel Maud. Meanwhile, the men, women and children stood around, most engaging in friendly banter, some taking the opportunity to break ranks and sit down on the grass verge to rest their weary legs, whilst others disappeared into the surrounding fields and hawthorn hedges to relieve themselves. Good humour prevailed. Daniel Maud had discreetly placed his cavalry, infantry and police away from the road, but visible, so as to demonstrate he had sufficient force, including armed force, to deal with any trouble, whilst not being too provocative. He came out to meet them. "Good morning, Mr. Maud," Michael O'Donnell greeted him. "It's a fine day, so it is." Maud smiled. "It is indeed, Mr. O'Donnell. I'd be obliged to you if you would introduce me to your friends." "Certainly, Mr. Maud." He turned to his companions and introduced each in their turn. "Mr. Richard Pilling, Mr. William Stevenson, Mr. William Aitken and Mr. Patrick Murphy Brophy. James Leach and Daniel Donovan you've already met, Mr. Maud. Mr. Pilling is our spokesman today. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Daniel Maud, Justice of the Peace and Stipendiary Magistrate for the Borough of Manchester." Daniel Maud shook hands with each, treating them as if they were favoured guests. When it came to James Leach and Daniel Donovan, he smiled. "I hope your appearance in my court wasn't too much of an inconvenience, gentlemen?" James Leach laughed. "I've no memory of the calling us gentlemen on that occasion," he pointed out. During recent months, the Anti-Corn Law League had stepped up its campaigning. Initially, it held open-air public meetings, hoping to repeat the monster meetings the Chartists were famed for. Unfortunately, the representatives of the masses attending came not to express their support for the League, but their contempt for the manufacturers, heckling and harassing the speakers. The League resorted to indoor meetings, entry by ticket only, and passed resolutions in support of their own cause, claiming they'd been carried at public meetings and represented Manchester public opinion. In order to expose this duplicity, Michael, James Leach, Daniel Donovan and others obtained tickets through the good offices of Irene Rose, and had recently attended a meeting addressed by Cobden. As soon as Cobden rose to speak, Michael asked the chairman if it was a public meeting. Without further ado, the chairman signalled the blue bottles in attendance and had Michael arrested. The process was repeated in turn by James Leach and Daniel Donovan, and they too were arrested and all bundled off to the town hall to appear before the magistrate at the Manchester Borough Court, who happened to be Daniel Maud, Esquire. Maud, being a fair man, removed his Liberal Anti-Corn Law League hat, and donned the Tory mantle of Sir Robert Peel, wishing to remain impartial for the occasion. He told them their behaviour was disgraceful, provocative, and likely to promote a breach of the peace. He informed them he was well aware who they were, that they were political vagabonds whose mission in life seemed confined to causing uproar and discontent at meetings, alarming and upsetting decent, law-abiding citizens in the process. A stop must be put to this kind of thing, he admonished them. The public should not have to put up with it, and I'm determined to put an end to it. At that point, knowing the three had committed no offence, and therefore he could inflict no punishment upon them, he passed judgment. I order you to pay costs this time. Make sure you do not appear before me in the future. Think yourselves lucky I have treated you with leniency. By that time, the Anti-Corn Law League meeting had ended without further interruption, and its requisite resolutions passed safely. The representatives of the Free Trade Press in attendance, particularly the Manchester Guardian, went off to do their political duty, reporting the results of another expression of Manchester public opinion, completely uninhibited by the truth. Michael O'Donnell chuckled inwardly at Leach's response, as Maud turned his attention to Richard. "Mr. Pilling, can I ask the purpose of your visit to Manchester?" Pilling smiled. "Me friends and me are all working men and women, as you can see for yourself. We've been told our masters are suffering terrible distress due to lack of trade. Us thought we should be seen for ourselves, so we're off to Cotton Exchange to see how prices of yarn and cloth are doing." Daniel Maud received this statement in good humour, smiled affably, and assured him he had no objection to their entering the town, providing they kept the peace and stuck to a prescribed route, a copy of which he presented to Pilling. With that, the magistrate took his leave and rejoined his troops, watching as the march reassembled and carried on into Manchester. He knew his prescribed route may not be adhered to, but he had the names of the strike leaders, and spies were planted within the workers' ranks, if arrests were to be made and heads cracked. Securing the support of the Manchester textile, engineering and building workers was a key objective for the trade union leaders. Within hours of the march from Hyde into the town, almost every mill and factory stood silent, the boiler plugs removed, and committees for public safety elected to ensure essential work continued. The Manchester workers welcomed their out-of-town sisters and brothers, providing them with accommodation and sustenance. The taverns and beerhouses did thrive in business, and were later taken over by strikers without accommodation as makeshift overnight shelters. Wherever the Irish congregated, music sessions were guaranteed, music being the cement and mortar that bound them together and helped them retain their distinctive Celtic culture, all too often misunderstood by their English neighbours and frequently suppressed and outlawed by the ruling class. The Irish workers in the little island portion of Charlton upon Medlock, Irish Town and Ancoats were no exception to this rule. They brought out their fiddles and their newly introduced and increasingly popular banjos, along with their traditional bodhrans, whistles and flutes, and soon every possible venue from pubs to church halls rang out with the sound of jigs and reels, mazurkas and polkas, waltzes, songs of rebellion, and slow Irish airs, as they entertained their guests into the wee hours. Mary's Kitchen stayed open late, the co-op workers supplemented by volunteers from Gibraltar Mill, providing a nourishing stew with bread at cost price to all those who required it. Over 100 strikers found warm blankets and floor space in the barn and under the awning, with braziers to warm them. Mary Upton, with the help of Irene Rose and Michael O'Donnell, enlisted the help of Father Daniel Hearn, the parish priest of St. Patrick's in Irish Town. The good father agreed to mobilise his parishioners to set up soup kitchens throughout the working-class districts. This represented an important step forward, with large numbers of strikers to be catered for. Unlike most Manchester workers, who were predominantly agnostics or atheists, an agnostic being merely an atheist who hadn't quite come to terms with it, the Irish hung on to their Catholicism, or, in some cases, their Protestantism. In much the same way and for much the same reasons they clung to their music. The church provided a venue where they could meet and receive news from home and the wider diaspora of Irish migration. Whilst the priests were educated men, most were Irish and tended to be from their own or a similar class background. They spoke Irish, as the Irish workers did, and were not associated with their masters or with government. The priests also tended to travel to Ireland frequently, and were therefore a source of contact with relatives back home. Father Daniel Hearn was a well-known character and important ally of the working classes. He frequently intervened in disputes, replacing hostility with peace. Arguments could be between rival Irish groups, between Catholics and Orangemen, the latter having a significant presence in Manchester, between the Irish and Italians, or between Irish and Italians with their English neighbours, not least with the police. As such, his advice was sought and trusted by all working-class communities, irrespective of religious allegiance, or, in most cases, the lack of it. A well-known supporter of Daniel O'Connell and the Irish Repeal Association, he campaigned for repeal of the Act of Union and for Irish Home Rule. Like O'Connell, he opposed violence. He also supported the Anti-Corn Law League and opposed Chartism. Yet, he regularly contributed articles to the Chartist supporting paper, the Northern Star, and tended to attract the support of Chartists and those who supported them for his work amongst the Irish community in Manchester. He opposed child labour, organised education classes for children and adults, and founded an orphanage. He established 7 schools in total, and over 1,000 children in any one year owed their ability to read and write largely to him. In later years, he became more militant, joined the Young Irelanders, and was eventually forced to leave Manchester, driven out by the church authorities, but that lay in the future. On that first night in Manchester, 18 strike leaders, including Richard Pilling, William Stevenson, and others from the Ashton-under-Lyne, Stalybridge and Hyde contingent, joined by James Leach, Daniel Donovan and Alexander Hutchinson, together with Daniel Ackroyd and young Daniel, gathered under Matthew Etherow's roof. The next day, the 10th, the workers would march across Blackfriars Bridge into Salford. On the 11th, a further march, mainly of Manchester strikers, to enable their comrades to return to their hometowns, was planned, the objective being nearby Stockport. Matthew sought out the company of Richard Pilling, by then known as the Grand Old Man of Chartism, in Ashton-under-Lyne and the surrounding districts. The mill owner asked him how old he was. "I'm none too sure, but going off what my mother told me, about 42. Matthew's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Pilling caught the loop. "I know what they're thinking, Mr. Etherow. No doubt if I'd lived similar life to thyself, I'd look about 36, instead of 60, maybe." "I'm sure you're right, no doubt about it, Richard. What exactly are they paying weavers now in Ashton?" "Both my sons aren't weavers. They aren't family breadwinners, me being ticketed. They work for Rayner. In 1840 they were paid 12p. halfpenny a cut and did 30 cuts a week between them, bringing home £1 11s and threepence, just 15 shillings 7p. halfpenny each. Or next year or so, masters cut wages 3 times, bringing them down to 7 shillings 11p. per week. And then the masters announced quite a cut, which is reason for us being here on holiday." Matthew nodded. "Is that all the income you have?" "Aye, a family of 9 to make do on 15 shillings 10p. per week. Now it's down to 8 of us. One of my sons died of consumption just afore the strike. We've lost his wage. We're down to 8 shillings a week less penny, and have to pay 3 shillings a week for rent." He looked Matthew in the eye. "There's many worse off than me. Dost think thee could live on that?" Matthew shook his head. Irene Rose had listened to this discussion with great interest, although she had remained silent, a very unusual situation for her. At last she couldn't refrain from making a comment. "My real concern is how Queen Victoria manages. Parliament only allows her £164 17 shillings and 10p. a day to live on. I think that's a disgrace." "You ain't, Miss Rose. I'd ha' thought they could have rounded 10p. up to a full shilling for poor lass. Maybe she should join union, Richard responded. How much does thou pay thy workers, Matthew? 18 shillings a week, and that's for a 10-hour day, Monday to Friday, and 6 hours on Saturday. Richard seemed surprised at this response. Dost thou make a profit? He asked. Gibraltar Mill sounded like a worker's paradise to him. Matthew laughed at his amazement. Aye, Richard, I make a good profit. Maybe not quite as much as Rayner, but I can assure you I make more than enough. Although Manchester had been the key objective, the strike spread fast. Within days, work had ceased in Accrington, Bacup, Blackburn, Bolton, Burnley, Bury, Chorley, Combe, Congleton, Glossop, Leek, Macclesfield, Oldham, St Helens, Rawtenstall, Todmorden, Wigan, and in most Lancashire mining communities. Peace reigned. Manchester that weekend resembled a festival rather than the storm centre of Britain's first general strike. There had been some problems, largely prompted by overzealous magistrates and reactionary employers. In Manchester itself, the only real outbreak of violence had been at Burley's Mill. The Tory mill owner had brought in police to resist the turnout, and a brief skirmish resulted. Unlike Burley, most Manchester manufacturers were more than cooperative, some even giving their employees permission to turn out before the marchers from Hyde approached them, although most didn't have chance to demonstrate their philanthropy, their workers not seeing the need to obtain their master's permission in the first place. However, in Bacup, at a mass meeting called to elect delegates to the Trades Conference, magistrates felt the need to read the Riot Act and instructed the hands to disperse immediately. The workers ignored the order, successfully completing their meeting 1.5 hours later, the magistrates lacking the force to compel them to do otherwise. Basically, the authorities were taken completely by surprise, both by the strength of feeling exhibited by the workers and the speed with which they'd been able to spread the strikes. After one humiliation on top of another, the working classes were in little mood to endure more. Furthermore, troops were few and far between in the north of England at this time, making it impossible for the civil authorities to impose their will. The local middle-class politicians were more than impressed by the degree of organisation they faced. They had assumed they were provoking the mobilisation of a disorganised rabble, a mob to be manipulated and controlled for their own ends. It slowly dawned upon them that those they represented, and the Anti-Corn Law League, rapidly faced being outflanked and outmanoeuvred. The initiative and control of events was passing into the hands of the local trade union and Chartist leaders. Moreover, it was becoming increasingly obvious the trade union leaders and the Chartists were one and the same set of people. The general strike increasingly took on the appearance of a political strike, a fact not escaping the notice of the Tory government, as subsequent events would show.